Okay, thank you very much indeed, everybody, for being here to listen to us, and thank you for inviting us to come and present this study today. Is that okay now? Okay. As in the case of the study that we heard about this morning, this one was carried out over 9 months, beginning in October 12 and ending in July 13, which was, as people mentioned this morning, quite demanding because we both had full-time jobs, and indeed we couldn't have carried it out without the help of 3 other people who are not mentioned on the slide that you see there. Maria del Mar Gutierrez Colon Plana from the University of Tarragona, Alberto Lombardo Kasparos from the same university, and from the University of Leicester, research assistant Fiona Soliman. We're extremely grateful to them for all their help. The aims of our project were kind of threefold. We wanted to examine how translation can contribute to the learning of a foreign or second language in primary, secondary, and tertiary education. We kept an open mind in so far as our questionnaires were concerned that we sent out to people about what translation might be, because we really wanted them to tell us about their own conception about translation. In the report, however, if you have a copy of that, you will see that we provide a very extensive definition of what we, well, not definition, but a sort of account of what we mean by translation. Basically, just summarizing that quickly, it's texts that are related as target text to source text. Whatever kind of text that might be, whatever direction they might go in, whatever medium it might be, we see that as translation. But you can look at the report and read that for yourselves. Secondly, we wanted to compare and contrast attitudes to language teaching methods in different countries. The primary countries were 7 in Europe, and which they were was partly determined by the tender that we were responding to. And then there were 3 other countries from where we got information kind of spontaneously from people who heard about the study that we were carrying out. And our third aim was to propose guidelines for future action. Now, the scope of the project was quite wide in a sense. We collected data using 2 questionnaires, one for teachers, so language teachers, and that was an online questionnaire, and one for experts. Those were people who had insight into the kinds of policies that governed how language teaching was carried out in schools and universities in their respective countries. We got a large number of responses, as you can see here on the slide. We got 963 responses from a total of 15 countries. The 5 extra, in addition to the 10 that we had sort of bargained for, were Turkey, Lithuania, Sweden, Albania, and Italy, where colleagues very kindly sent us information because they would like to contribute to what we were doing. Of those nearly 1,000 respondents, 2/3 came from the member states and about 1/3 from the comparison countries. So we think we give a pretty good outline of what is happening in the member states that we looked at, and I'll tell you which they were in a moment. Now, we asked 7 questions, and I'll just go through those now so that when I come to talk about them in more detail, you'll know what they related to primarily. So the first question was, can translation contribute to effective language learning? And the second question was, what is the comparative pedagogical value of translation comparatively to other methods? Those 2 questions we primarily found answers to from a literature review, which I'll also come back to in a moment. Our third question was, does the value of translation depend on the learning aims? We got some information on that from the literature review and some from the surveys that we carried out. The fourth question was, does translation currently form a part of the curriculum? Fifth question, so these questions that I'm talking about now were addressed by the questionnaire surveys. The fifth question, is there a willingness to introduce translation where it isn't already used? The sixth question was, Are there different attitudes to the use of translation in language learning in monolingual countries and in bilingual countries? And finally, how can translation as a method of language learning be made attractive and motivating? And the answers to that question we derived partly from what people told us and partly from published pedagogical materials. Now, our case study countries, as I said, were partly determined by the nature of the tender, by the description that we were given of what we had to do. But the countries were, that we selected, Croatia, Finland, France, Germany, Poland, Spain, and the United Kingdom. Croatia was chosen because it is a small country and it is a new member of the Union. Croatia joined the Union on the 1st of July 1913, so actually after we'd already started the study, but obviously they would have made preparations for joining before that. Finland was chosen because we wanted to have a Scandinavian country, and also Finland is bilingual. We also wanted bilingual countries, clearly. France and Germany were chosen because they were large, established members of the Union, one of which has a rather better reputation as a language learning country than the other. I leave it to you to decide which that might be. Poland was selected because it's a big country, relatively new. It joined the Union in 2004. Spain was selected as a bilingual country, and the United Kingdom was selected because it is so appallingly bad at language learning, and also because, in spite of that, it has had a number of very specific investigations or recommendations or studies of the learning of languages. The Nuffield Report of 2000, the National Strategy for Language Learning of 2002, and currently there's a revision of the National Curriculum for Language Learning in which we know that translation is going to be included as a part of language teaching for children from the ages of 7 to 14. So it's a kind of interesting place to look at. Now, these countries are by no means heterogeneous. So some of them are have very different policies in different parts of them, and so for some of the countries we focus on particular areas. So in Croatia we focused on Zagreb. In Finland we focused on Turku because that's probably the most bilingual part of Finland, where there's a lot of there are many Swedish speakers in Turku. In Germany, we focused on Rhineland-Pfalz region primarily. In Poland, on Gdansk. In Spain, on Tarragona. And in the United Kingdom, on England. France, we think, is more unified in terms of its language policy, so we sampled all of France. The comparison countries that we selected were Australia, where there are many immigrant languages which are fairly well catered for. China, because it is a big country with an enormous growth and a great growth and interest in translation in language teaching and learning. And the United States, because it's sort of big and sort of like Europe, and also there are bilingual parts of it which we particularly looked at. We looked at Monterey County in California and Tucson, Arizona. In Australia, we looked primarily at Perth. China, we sampled sort of all over, really. We carried out some literature reviews. We looked first of all on EU policy on language learning from 2002 to 12, which doesn't mention translation in any systematic way, really. And then we looked on EU policy on multilingualism from 2008 to 12, which mentions translation primarily as an alternative to language learning. So either you put all your effort into language learning, in which case you don't need translation, or you focus a lot on translation but not so much on language learning. I'm obviously exaggerating a little bit, but there was that opposition in that particular literature. I could tell you which documents we looked at, but I don't want to take too much time, and maybe that can come up in questioning. There's a third policy, though, that we looked at as well, and this is the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, which has been tremendously influential. A lot of our respondents referred to that document. And this document lists mediation, including, very specifically, including translation and interpreting as one of the main language skills to be acquired by students in schools and universities studying languages. So that was a literature review of policies on language learning. A second literature review that we carried out looked into historical debates on the use of translation in language teaching and learning. And we focused particularly on the grammar translation method, which developed as an adjustment of the traditional scholastic method of teaching languages to highly educated individuals who would be given a grammar and a dictionary and would, by means of those two kinds of applied linguistics material, be able to work their way through very complex texts. This is a method of language learning which was not really suitable when large groups of students in schools have to learn modern languages. So for those larger groups of students, this method was adjusted in such a way that instead of just giving people a text and asking them to translate it, they would be working with individual sentences which could be graded for difficulty and which could also focus on individual aspects of language. But doing that meant that the individual sentences that such students would be working with would be unconnected to each other, really. And so that method of teaching language went against the belief in the connectivity of ordinary language use, which became much in focus in later years, and which are, of course, the foundation of so-called natural methods of language learning and teaching and communicative language teaching. So there was a very strong reaction against this artificial way of looking at constructed sentences, away from that towards more focus on natural language use. And really that sort of was the final nail in the coffin of the so-called grammar translation method. We also looked at empirical research, and I'll come back to that in a little while, but the empirical research of usage of translation in language teaching and learning suggests that mental translation occurs in most L2 learning situations, whether you like it or not, and that translation activities can have certain positive effects on classroom discussions. So our first question, which we addressed primarily by way of the literature research, was, can translation contribute to effective language learning? And we found from this work that yes, it can and does, as I said, often as mental translation, with certain exceptions, as far as this literature review is concerned. It is felt that it is difficult to use even mental translation when there are many different first languages present in the second language learning class. Secondly, it's difficult to use when translation is understood in a narrow word-for-word sense, because that can interrupt fluency in the second language. We also found that translation was far less present in primary school teaching. Here are some graphics which represent our findings. When I finished my part of this presentation, Anthony will show you lots more graphics which will summarize our findings in a different way from my more discursive summary here. But these graphics here clearly show that translation exercises are in fact used in language teaching and learning. There is a sort of global mean, as you can see from this slide, in the middle to low frequency range. So most of our respondents said that they do use translation sometimes or regularly, even though there are other respondents who don't use it at all. But you can clearly see the preponderance in the middle there, sort of some use of translation. So it is present in language classrooms, regardless of what people feel about it. Our second question then was, what is the comparative pedagogical value of translation? And this is the comparative aspect here is in regard to other language teaching methodologies. And again, during the discussion, if you want to, we can tell you what those were. We found that translation isn't seen as a language learning method in its own right, generally. It is often seen, though, as a check on acquisition and as the way of exploring differences between language systems. We found in the literature that its potential advantages were clear. It has a positive effect on L2 writing, comprehension, and discussion, and it tends to encourage people to focus on the structure and vocabulary of the second language, which is very interesting. It's a very interesting finding, because one of the worries about using translation in language teaching is that it will draw attention away from the language to be learned. In the literature that exists, we find the opposite is the case. If you present people with translation exercises, they start to think about the differences between the languages and therefore also about the language that they are learning and its structures. Our third question was, does the value of translation depend on the learning aim? And we found from the questionnaire studies that translation is not perceived as enhancing spoken fluency. Now this is partly because for some respondents, translation may not have included interpreting, of course. We found that translation has been shown to enhance the development of comprehension and second language writing skills, as I said. There was some suggestion that it might be valuable for intercomprehension, although we didn't find any clear evidence for this. By intercomprehension, we and our respondents meant a situation where people don't necessarily share one language, but they understand each other's language, and so each person speaks in their own language, but you understand each other, and that's fine. We found that translation may be most valuable for learning aims that don't involve whole language systems. That is, so if the learning aim is limited to maybe language for certain purposes, translation might be more valuable than if the idea is to just sort of acquire the whole language system in one lot. And obviously, well, maybe not obviously, should never say obviously, but for developing spoken and written translation skills, translation was helpful. Question 4 was, does translation currently form a part of the curricula in the member states? And here we found that in Croatia and Spain, translation wasn't used as a systematic approach to language learning. In Finland, it was not mentioned in the Finnish national core curriculum for basic education. In France, translation was banned completely from language teaching. That's not to say it wasn't present, but it wasn't supposed to be present, according to policy, from 1950 to the early 1990s, and there was some sense that it is still being discouraged. In Germany, the situation varies from land to land and is largely dependent on whether translation figures in the examination system, not surprisingly. In Poland, translation isn't used as a systematic approach to language learning and it isn't mentioned in the core curriculum. I mentioned Spain together with Croatia. In the United Kingdom, as I said, it's due for introduction in 2014 for children aged 11 to 14. So we look forward to seeing whether the world will be transformed in the UK by this. We shall see. Our fifth question was, is there a willingness to introduce translation? And we got some interesting responses to this. There was some perception among some people that translation was prohibited. They thought they just weren't allowed to use it. There's no evidence to support this, but we did get quite a lot of responses, particularly from Spain, to the effect that parents of school children would be upset if they found that Spanish was present in the classroom. People would like to see just the language to be learnt in the classroom. Of those teachers who replied that the curriculum forbids language, translation in language classroom, 12% said they wouldn't use translation even if they were permitted to do so. Of 114 teachers who used translation never or rarely, 8% had never considered it seriously, and 5% said that they didn't feel qualified. 22%, that makes 25 teachers, said that translation is detrimental to language learning, and 17 of those were from France. I should add, really, that we tried to get as many respondents as we could, but the number of respondents from different countries varied widely. So you shouldn't see this as a definitive survey, statistically fully significant, but we did our best. So take it all with some salt. Question 6 was whether there is a difference in attitude in bilingual countries. Of the countries that we looked at, there is bilingualism in Finland, Catalonia, in Spain, and the United States. In Catalonia and the United States, translation activities are used less than the global average, but that's not the case in Finland. In Catalonia and the United States, immersion, by which was generally meant a situation where students are put into an environment in which they only use the language that they're learning. That's what was meant by immersion, mainly. Immersion is valued more than the global average, but this is not so in Finland. So there are these very interesting differences between Finland and the two other bilingual countries. And we can discuss what might have caused this. Now, question 7 was, how can translation as a method of language learning be made more attractive? And here we consulted available books on translation pedagogy, as well as our own experience and advice that we got from a number of people who approached us about this. And we found that it can be made more attractive if it is used as a goal-driven communicative activity. We were surprised by opinions that we heard from various quarters to the effect that translation was to be discouraged because it wasn't communicative. That is a strange way of looking at translation, but when translation is seen as a goal-driven communicative activity, then it becomes much more attractive to students. It can also be attractive used as scaffolding in initial second language learning. Now there are two ways, of course, in which students come to terms with a new language, or it can be used by the students themselves to work with the new language in the context of the existing language. And in those primary classrooms where the second language is present, that is often seen as translation and a way of helping the students to get started, so scaffolding in L2 learning. It can be attractive when it's used to train students to use and combine multiple language resources and different media. So there's a lot of research on the use of, for example, subtitles in translation classrooms. It can be attractive when it's used for interesting, challenging and amusing activities. And at the end of our report, or close to the end, there are some suggestions for translation activities that can be used in classrooms. The translation of recipes and the use of, for example, machine-translated texts, which you can ask students to edit and to comment on the difficulties that they present. So, our main findings are that used as a communicative activity, translation can enhance the learning of a second language. That translation, as I said a little while ago, isn't seen as a language learning method in its own right, but usually is combined with a range of different approaches. In most cases, translation is not an explicit feature of language teaching curricula, but translation activities are nevertheless very common in classrooms. Translation can be used as scaffolding at early stages and as a complex activity at higher levels. And these activities have different relationships to language learning because early on, translation is used to kind of assist language learning to get started, whereas later on it can be used to make language learning progress at speed and to help language learning to develop rapidly, perhaps. More main findings were that there's a tendency for translation to be used less commonly in primary education and more commonly in higher education. And this is something that's happened for decades. So it's interesting for me to be here today because one of the first things I did in my career as a university teacher was a study of translation in language teaching and learning. And here I am nearing the end of my career and we're still really talking about the same issue, although now there are many more opportunities, of course, to use translation in multimedia and so on in language classrooms. Okay, non-communicative uses of translation, such as grammar translation, are regarded negatively, and grammar translation has had an immense influence on this whole issue, and it's about time that we laid it to rest, really. But to do that, we probably need people to form a different understanding of translation than many people have at the moment. We found that there's a growing theoretical research interest in the relationship between communicative translation and language teaching, and that translation can be a key activity in training students to use multiple language resources. So those were our main findings, and here are our guidelines for future action. We think that steps should be taken to foster a view of translation as a goal-driven communicative activity, beyond the universities, into the schools, and perhaps, if possible, the population as a whole. That second language teachers at all levels should have access to a communicative view of translation through publications, through online materials, or through short training courses. So we hope that it will be possible to get second language teachers sufficiently interested to undertake these kinds of activity. And now I'd like to hand over to Anthony, who is going to talk in more statistical detail about these findings. Thank you very much.